Good afternoon. It's beginning to look a lot like autumn. The leaves are already starting to change color, and some of them are already falling already. We've had glorious weather these past couple of weeks. Fall is our family's favorite season. We love the cooler weather, the return to school routines, and all things maple, pumpkin spice, and apple cider. This week in our Bible reading plan, besides continuing through the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, we read the short book of Esther. At my previous church in Iowa, we had a missionary with Chosen People Ministries named Trevor Rubenstein, who came and shared with us about the Jewish festival of Purim. The story of Purim is told in the book of Esther, which is set 100 years after the Babylonian exile in Susa, the capital of the kingdom of Persia. The Persian Empire had crushed the Babylonians and allowed the Jews to return home to Israel, but there were still Jews living in Persia. In the story, the Persian king Ahasuerus hosted a huge banquet that lasted 6 months. And then he drunkenly asked for Queen Vashti to be brought out so everyone could look at her. She refused. He had her thrown out and had a royal decree written to say that every man should be the master of his home, which is funny because his wife didn't obey him for good reason. They had a beauty pageant to find a new queen, and the king chose a Jewish girl named Esther. Her Jewish name was Hadassah, but she kept her ethnic identity secret. Then her uncle Mordecai, who had adopted her, overheard a plot between two royal guards to kill the king. He reported them, saving the king's life. In chapter 3, the villain of the story, Haman, was elevated to second in command in the kingdom. Haman was an Agagite, a descendant of the Canaanites, who were the ancient enemies of the Israelites. Haman became furious when Mordecai refused to bow to him in the street. Since Mordecai was Jewish, Haman plotted to have all the Jews killed. He rolled the dice, the Purim, to decide what day to have them all put to death. And what he rolled was the 13th of Adar, which was 11 months away. Haman had a banquet with the king, who signed the decree. The Jews were filled with despair. In chapter 4, Mordecai got Esther's attention, and they planned to reverse the decree. Esther had to risk her life by coming into the king's presence without being summoned. Mordecai said, "Deliverance will come from somewhere, through you or from someone else. But perhaps you've become queen for just such a time as this." Esther showed enormous courage. She said, "If I perish, I perish." And she asked for prayer. Esther bravely entered the throne room, and the king stretched out his scepter to her, showing her favor and sparing her life. He told her that he would give her whatever she wanted, even half of his kingdom. Esther invited him and Haman to a banquet. And again, he said, "Ask me for whatever you want, even half my kingdom." And then Esther asked them to another banquet, where she said she would tell everything on her mind. Well, immediately after the first banquet, Haman strutted home and boasted to his family about all of his children and all of his wealth and how the king had elevated him to this second in command position, and that even the queen had invited him and the king, just the two of them, to yet another banquet. But, he said, it was all worth nothing as long as he still saw Mordecai the Jew sitting at the city gate. At his family's suggestion, Haman had a 75-foot-tall sharpened stake set up in his courtyard for Mordecai to be impaled upon. He planned to ask the king the next morning to have Mordecai killed. But then, in chapter 6, there is a central story where everything turns. The king couldn't sleep, and he had the royal records read to him. Apparently, that's really good if you're trying to get back to sleep. But he heard how Mordecai had saved him months before, but was never rewarded. That morning, Haman came in to ask the king to have Mordecai killed. And the king first said to Haman, "What shall I do for the man I want to honor?" Well, Haman thought, it must be me that he wants to honor. So he said, "Have the king have someone dress the man in a royal robe that the king has worn. Put him on a horse that the king has ridden, and lead him through the streets, proclaiming, 'This is what is done to the man the king wishes to honor.'" And the king said, "That's perfect. You go and do that for Mordecai." And Haman did it. How humiliating. That night, at the second banquet Esther hosted for the king and Haman, she told the king that someone had plotted to kill all of her people, and then revealed that it was Haman. The king was so upset that he left the room. Haman threw himself on Esther's couch to plead with her, but the king walked back in and thought Haman was assaulting the queen, so he had Haman impaled on the stake Haman prepared for Mordecai. Then Esther and Mordecai planned to reverse the king's decree. Persian laws couldn't be undone. And so the king sent out a second decree commanding the Jews to defend themselves and destroy their enemies on the day before the first decree was to go into effect. The king signed it at yet another banquet. Mordecai was elevated to second in command, just as Haman had been early in the story. The Jews defended themselves and destroyed all their enemies. Mordecai made a decree that the people should celebrate the Jews' deliverance with a 2-day feast, which they called Purim, for the dice that Haman had thrown. When Trevor Rubinstein talked about Purim, he shared how in Jewish families and congregations, the entire book of Esther is read aloud or even performed every year. The people boo or use noisemakers every time Haman's name is mentioned, and they cheer whenever Esther or Mordecai's names are said. Trevor even brought traditional Jewish 3-cornered cookies to share that they make for Purim, called hamantashen, named after Haman. Esther is a very carefully crafted comic story. It follows an arc with lots of parallel scenes around that central pivotal moment in chapter 6, when the king remembered Mordecai saving his life and had Haman honor him. It was a great reversal that foreshadowed Haman's downfall and the deliverance of the Jews. Oddly, God is never mentioned in the book. The book also never mentions Jerusalem, the Torah, or the temple. It seems the author invites us to look for God's activity behind the scenes. There's all these coincidences and ironic reversals. Esther just happened to be the one the king chose as his new queen. Mordecai just happened to overhear the plot against the king. And the lot, or Purim, that Haman threw just happened to land on 11 months. Far out from the original, from when it could have been. The king just happened to be reminded of Mordecai saving his life the night before Haman planned to have Mordecai impaled. All these things point to God's provision and plan to rescue his people. There's also lots of moral ambiguity in the story. It's set not in Israel, but in the Persian court, which is depicted as very bawdy. The king seems perpetually drunk and persuadable. There's lots of drinking, sex, and murder in the story, in clear violation of God's commands. Even the heroes of the story don't seem to obey God's laws. There's no mention of them keeping kosher or observing the Sabbath. They adopt Persian customs and dress, and Esther even becomes the Persian queen. The point of this comic story is that despite their exile, the absence of God in the story and Israel's own moral compromise, God has not abandoned his people. He will accomplish his purposes to rescue them. One of the story's most famous lines is said by Mordecai to Esther. Perhaps you have been made queen for just such a time as this. Deliverance for the Jews will come from somewhere, but this is your moment, your chance to be part of what God wants to do. Esther responded with courage and boldness and saved her people. Few of us will have to risk our lives for God's purposes, but nevertheless, God wants to use us in the mission of his kingdom. How will we respond? Will we act with courage and boldness on God's behalf? What might God be calling you to do today? Where is he working behind the scenes all around you? This Sunday morning during adult class, I'm going to share my spiritual family tree, a visual of the people in my family as well as other people and experiences who have shaped my faith journey. It's based on a little book called Spiritual Family Trees by Barbara Wendland and Larry Easterling. It's a great way to think about and share your spiritual journey with others. I'll invite others who are willing to share their own spiritual family trees in the coming weeks as well. In the link to this video, I'll provide you with, or in the description, I'll provide you a link to the Bible Project's wonderful guide to the book of Esther. I invite you to watch that video and be blessed by it. Hope to see you in worship at 8:30 or 11 o'clock. Zach Carr will be our guest pianist and vocalist. Have a great rest of the week.